It's Sanctus Real, Unstoppable God. You're on Vision Christian Radio. It's Neil Johnson with you. It is the Friday edition of 2020, a conversation you might like to join into over this next hour. We're going to turn our attention to the challenges that lie ahead and the prediction that Western culture is reaching a critical juncture. On the back of the global COVID pandemic, many economies around the world are being brought to their knees. The Russian invasion of Ukraine, the rise of China, and its sights set on Taiwan threaten to draw the nations of the world into war. Iran's nuclear ambitions threaten more possible nuclear conflict. Then add to that the gap between rich and poor widening, threatening political unrest. It may sound alarmist, but there are predictions that a collapse might be imminent. And part of that may even include irreligiosity, abandoning faith in God. Western power has been in gradual decline, and this is going to be the focus of our conversation over the next hour. Our special guest is former federal politician George Christensen. In life after Parliament, he's emerged as a commentator on the challenges facing the West. He's never been shy to have his Christian values shape his public persona, and he's not holding back in his commentary blog called Nation First. We'll talk more about that shortly, but let me make a special welcome along to 2020. George Christensen, welcome back.
Well, thanks very much, Neil. It's great to be back on your show. Thank you to you for inviting me on there, and it's great to be speaking through you to all your listeners.
George, you spent 9 years in the Parliament. You're on the other side of your parliamentary career now. I mentioned Nation First. Give us a little update on where you're at.
Yeah, actually, it was nearly 11 years, actually, I think, Neil. And just to add on the punishment, there was 6 years in local government as well. So it's almost 2 decades in public service, and it's been quite a transition. But I do now have this online publication that I'm dedicating myself full time to, along with a couple of other online media ventures, including a YouTube show that I am now trying to put out regularly, and an online news website. But that keeps me very busy. I'm not sure it keeps me out of trouble, but it keeps me very busy now.
You've been a outspoken conservative, but there's something that I'll often describe as a classical conservatism, and that is that brand of conservatism that actually appreciates and understands its Christian roots, and you've never been afraid of your Christianity. How does your current role in your blog and in your commentary on Western Civilization, how's that affected by your own faith, George?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. It's part of me, Neil. I believe firmly in the Christian faith. I believe in God. I believe in the Holy Trinity. I believe all that which the church believes, and without a doubt, it shines through in my writings. Now, I don't try and make Nation First in itself overtly Christian. Sometimes, as I said, Christian messages come through. I do realise that there are actually a lot of my readers that are atheist or agnostic as well, so as long as they bear with a few God bless yous, they're okay. But look, I think that even the messages that I put through nationfirst.substack.com, which is the publication, can even be appreciated by those who are not of the Christian faith or not of any faith, because they are, while they are views and values that are probably appreciated by many Christians, they are views and values that are appreciated by those who just simply appreciate Western tradition. And that is important. The two are actually enmeshed, and that's why it can be appreciated beyond just those of the Christian faith.
Interestingly, when we talk about Western civilization, and even we're going to touch on some vulnerabilities here, and I mentioned in the introduction this thought of irreligiosity, the thought that conservatism in particular has been losing its religion, losing its faith, and almost looking a little bit like its own opposition. Thoughts here on the values of the Christian tradition to the way that Western formation has happened?
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head, and this is something that I actually haven't touched on. I mean, why has conservatism and the conservative movement in so many Western cultures, Western societies, why has it seemingly slipped from its mooring? And it quite possibly is entwined with the fact that that Christianity has been largely abandoned by Western culture. I mean, you just have a look at the latest census in Australia to see the decline in Christianity as a religion of influence. Still, by far the biggest faith that we've got there, but it's declined so much that I think there's more people of no religion now, or it's getting that way. And that's Australia isn't Robinson Crusoe on that front, and that affects every different faction, if I can call it that, within a culture, including the faction that likes to describe itself as a conservative or conservative faction. There probably are more people within that particular faction of Australian society that would be of the Christian faith, but as it declines in the culture, so too it declines within that particular faction within society. And look, you know, conservatism being a political philosophy that is guided by or that sees as its objective as conserving all that is good in the past, and ensuring that the change isn't just simply for change's sake. Change is for the sake of good and the sake of what's right. That you keep the good, and Christianity has been one of those forces of good. You know, there's a lot of people that disparage Christianity, Neil. You and I both know that. We see it and probably hear it every day, particularly through the mainstream media. But you know, while others might think of, you know, the horrors of the Christian past, whether that be the, you know, Crusades, or they might think, oh, there's too many wars that have been started by religion, or they might think of, you know, abuse within, say, the Catholic Church or something like that. What I think of is how the church and the Christian faith has actually nurtured just about every good thing in our society, whether it be education, whether it be health, whether it be charity. All of these things in our modern culture have actually derived from the Christian faith. Why? Because at the heart of the Christian faith is the golden rule: do unto others. That's what Christ taught us. And so that is why the Christian faith has been such a nurturing influence on Western culture. If you're going to throw it out, though, you're going to see the consequences of it. We're going to be a less nurturing, less compassionate society, every aspect of it now.
There are those who, as you describe, are, you know, looking for change's sake, and the description of conservatism as trying to hold on to those good values and those good foundations of the past. So when you've got change for change's sake, or perhaps what you might say is, you know, maybe the progressive agenda, the thought that there might be actually some level of skepticism in us, that their motives may not be all good. This is where the challenge comes in, the motives of those who want change.
Yeah, it does. I think, though, that largely these days their cause is aided and abetted by just about every cultural institution that we see around us. And I think I heard Bill Muhlenberg before when I got on here, and Bill's an expert on this. He knows that there has been a steady infiltration in all of our cultural institutions. They actually called it the Long March. The Long March into the institutions. The leftists or cultural Marxists, either knowingly or unknowingly, went on a bit of a campaign to capture universities, schools, media, all sorts of cultural institutions that help shape society. And so nowadays, and particularly with the younger generation, and probably include, my age sort of down in that, if you're in your sort of, if you're below the age of 50 and maybe even below the age of 60, actually, that you've probably been influenced in some way, shape or form by that fact that there has been this capture of our cultural institutions. And, hey, look, maybe even if you're older and you're sitting there watching TV and you're on social media, whether we know it or not, we are captured by everything that we see around us. If we're watching mainstream media, if we're looking at our news through mainstream news organisations, if that's where we're getting our formation from, then we're affected by the culture.
We're affected by the culture, and let's put all ourselves in the category of being that younger generation you're talking about. Let's say 60 is the new 40, and we'll say, yes, we can see that the institutions that are shaping our culture are being overtaken by all sorts of things that look very anti or un-Christian. Now, is it alarmism, or is there some level of real foundation and real evidence for the possibility of the fall of the West? Let's get your thoughts on that. The fall of the West, what does that look like even? What would you imagine it to look like? Is it something that's like a bloodless coup? How do you describe the possibility of such a thing, George?
Well, I hate to be a pessimist so early in the morning, but we're living through it, Neil. I think that what does it look like? Look out the window of the studio if you can, because people expect to see that there's going to be a major battle, that some major war is going to happen and it's going to level us. Well, that's not how it happens. It happens slowly, and it happens slowly but irrevocably, and I can just say that there's a bit of a triangulation, a quadrangulation going on. We have a look at some of the things that that hold a civilization together. Can I say culture? We've already talked about that to a degree. Demographics, economics, democracy. Can I just focus on culture for a moment? We talked about cultural institutions, but let me just say one of the key things about our culture is that we've become a culture that's quite decadent, quite focused on self, and there's no higher purpose than self. And so, if you believe that, and I think that I don't even need actually to convince you or your audience that our culture has gone into that hyper individualistic, hyper consumerist way of life, and that just rips the guts out of the culture. It really, really does. We move away from that Christian ideal of do unto others, just to do unto me. Do unto me. Whatever I want, whenever I want, however I want. I am God. That's basically the sense that we've gotten, and what happens then is that family bonds become very weak. We have a very easy setup where an entire generation can grow up hating their own heritage and identity. Why? Because it's not focused on me. The past isn't focused on me and what I want. We look at the gender fluidity fad that's actually gripping youth at the moment. Did you know that while less, I got the American statistics here, I think the Australian ones probably would be a little bit different, but maybe not so far off. And particularly, this is our future. It's less than 6% of the overall American population actually identifies as LGBTIQ. I could go on because there's a whole heap of other acronyms that you could add to it. It's like almost an alphabet soup. But at the moment, I think it is about 1 in 6. 1 in 6, or 1 in 5, actually. I'm just looking at the figures here. 1 in 5 identify as part of that alphabet soup. So how is it that in Generation Z, we can have 1 in 5 identifying as part of the LGBTIQ community, and yet of the overall community, only 6%? Something has happened, and I don't say this to just jump on the gay bandwagon. I don't say it's just merely to point out that something has taken place. There's been a fundamental shift in culture. So that's just one aspect, Neil. If we look at what I said before, cultural institutions, we can look at the state of our education system. And I think that that's got a lot to do with, the whole LGBTIQ thing here. The reality is we've got woke teachers that are out there conducting a war on our children, brainwashing them into accepting theories that are as fact and leaving them unable to make their own opinions, actually, on important yet sensitive topics. They're being taught, quite frankly, in schools to be hateful of their own heritage, hateful of their own true identity, of traditions. They're being exposed to material that's just simply not suitable for their age. They're being taught to deconstruct everything, including their own biological reality. This is going on in our schools right now, and as a result, in 2019, the US Journal of Abnormal Psychology found that half of 12 to 13-year-olds they survey reported being depressed. What is happening to the next generation? How is this not alarming? How is this not being discussed openly? This is an age where young people should be free of these sort of worries. When I was 12 or 13, the whole world was ahead of me. Life was pretty good, Neil. I don't know what it is today that's caused children to be in this state, but I've got a suspicion. And the suspicion is that when you have lost your true identity, you are lost indeed. And that's the state of our youth today, I'm afraid. So I could talk about more of these things. There's other things I said. There's a quadrangulation going on. We've got culture. We've got the corruption of our democracy. And that's pretty big to say as a former MP. I could talk about that. We've got economic decline as well. And then we've got demographic decline. So all of these four factors are having some impact.
We'll get into some of those, and I do want to invite listeners to join into the conversation too. Our talkback line open on 1-800-316-316. You might like to have your own say on how you think things are developing here in Australia. Are we on the verge of a collapse of Western civilization? Do you think this is just something localised, something that's happening here in Australia? Your thoughts on young people, and I'll often point people, George, to the idea of need to protect younger generations, and they do some fabulous research at Mission Australia, the biggest youth survey in the nation, and that gives you those sorts of impressions as you're quoting some US statistics. There are some wonderful statistics about our young people that are coming through that organisation, Mission Australia. We're going to take a short break and continue our conversation. 1-800-316-316, talking about the vulnerabilities of Western civilization. You can have your say. 1-800-316-316. Well, sounds alarmist, but there are predictions that a collapse may be imminent around Western civilization. You might like to join in our conversation on 1-800-316-316. Our special guest is former federal politician George Christensen. These days, he's emerged as a commentator on the challenges facing the West, And you can connect with him at nationfirst.substack.com and have access to his newsletter. George, before we take some questions, let me just come back to a few things you mentioned just before we went to the break. You mentioned there were issues around our demographics and our economics and our democracy. Let's start with demographics, because people on this program have suggested that, our ageing population's about to fall off a cliff. That's what's happening in the boomer generation. And there are challenges with the way we're replacing our generation, and ultimately it's likely to come from immigration. Thoughts here on demographics?
Yeah, look, your listeners are spot on with what they've just suggested there. I mean, that is a fact right across, this is not a new phenomenon either, right across Western civilization. We have hit the point where our birth rate is below replacement level, or at that sort of just level where it's just replacing itself. I think Australia is at the level where it's just replacing itself. But you'd find that is actually largely due to the fact that we have a high immigration level. So it is people coming from other non-Western cultures that are picking us up and making sure that we replace ourselves. It's just simple fact that we aren't going to replace ourselves as Western nations, and I think it's intimately tied to the cultural issue that I talked about before. Again, I just say, when you've cut off your true identity, when you've grown to be hateful of your heritage, then you're not going to want to replace yourself. I mean, what is the point of continuing on? So again, that's probably not a conscious decision that people are making, but it's one that becomes more of a subconscious or unconscious action. And I guess intertwined with that is also the fact that the focus is more on me, Neil. The focus is more on self. And so children and families are now seen as a burden rather than as a blessing by many in our culture. And just to look at that, I mean, and I didn't want to go down this track, but it's just popped into my head. How many TV shows do we see where, the father's the idiot, the kids are a hassle? This is, now become the nature of sitcoms and even cartoon shows like The Simpsons. So,
so you've got this hateful of heritage, even fear of the future, and in some sense here, some might say a conversation like this creates a level of fear too, but you don't need a conversation that describes what's happening to know that people are fearful of the future. As you say, the way the family is construed is somewhat challenging. Hey, we're taking calls on 1-800-316-316. Let's take a call. Giovanni is on the Gold Coast in Queensland. Hi, Giovanni. Welcome along.
Yeah, thank you. How are you today? Good?
Good. Yes. What are your thoughts, Giovanni?
Well, my thoughts are this. I've been studying the book of Revelation for the last 10 years, and everything's falling into place. All the signs are there, and I'm out there evangelising, reaching the lost. People are searching for the truth, and that's what I'm doing, snatching the one from the fire, because the signs are there.
Giovanni, good to be able to talk about the book of Revelation, those expectations we have in the end of days, drawing George into an eschatological conversation here. I'm not sure whether you're across all those sorts of details, George, but what are your thoughts for Giovanni?
Well, I'm happy to go there, Neil, and thanks very much, Giovanni, for that observation. Look, I don't think that the fall of Western civilization equals the end of the world. And in fact, I've said this to people, Jesus didn't come to save Western civilization, he came to save us. And so we've got to be careful about that. We look at the fall of our own age, and we might translate that to the fall of the world, or the end of the world. That's not to say that Giovanni is wrong. I mean, there are some worrying signs out there about particularly the fusion of technology with mankind and where that might lead to. Neil, I don't want to go down this rabbit hole too much because it's it is a bit of a rabbit hole, but nonetheless, the talk about fusion of mankind with artificial intelligence, talk about microchipping of human beings. I mean, you start to hear some of this stuff where, people are predicting or even saying that technology will be available to ensure that we can sort of scan things, and that's how we're going to buy things with a microchip in our hand, and there'll be some form of tracking involved with that as well. And you think to yourself, wow, that book of Revelation is looking more and more like a reality these days. So, I can understand why people have these thoughts, but I just say clearly that the fall of Western civilization is not the end of the world. It's the end of the world as we know it, I guess. But Jesus didn't come to save Western civilization. He came to save us, mankind.
Thank you so much to Giovanni on the Gold Coast. And about to go to news. I want to invite listeners, join in the conversation. You might like to have your own say on 1-800-316-316. Might be about any of the issues we're talking about, demographics, the economics, the rise of various superpowers. You might even want to pursue something more on what George is talking about, the fusion of technology, transhumanism that's called, and how that even connects with a biblical idea of what happens in the end. Well, 1-800-316-316, back with more after news. It's good to have you with us on this Friday edition of 2020. Let me just say, our talkback line is open on 1-800-316-316. We'll take some more calls in a few moments. If you're just joining into our conversation, we're talking about the vulnerabilities of Western civilization and the challenges that lie ahead. The prediction, too, that Western culture is reaching a critical juncture. On the back of the global COVID pandemic, many economies around the world are being brought to their knees. The Russian invasion of Ukraine, the rise of China, with its sights set on Taiwan, threatening to draw the nations of the world into war. Iran's nuclear ambitions, threatening more possible nuclear conflict. The gap between rich and poor widening, threatening political unrest. It may sound alarmist, but there are predictions that a collapse might be imminent. And part of that may even include irreligiosity, abandoning faith in God. Western power has been in gradual decline, and one of those commentators who's emerging as being on the cutting edge. In other words, sometimes he says things very controversial. Sometimes he's introducing concepts no one's heard about before. Former federal politician George Christensen, in life after Parliament, he's emerged as a social commentator on the challenges facing Western civilization. He's never shy of his Christian values shaping his public persona, and he's not holding back in his commentary blog called Nation First at nationfirst.substack.com. Pardon me. Before we go any further, George, let me just take a call or two from listeners, and they might have some things to add to our conversation before we move on. Let's take another call. Wendy is in Casino in New South Wales. Hi, Wendy. Welcome.
Hello. How are you all?
Very well, Wendy. What are your thoughts?
Good, thank you. Yeah, well, I just want to first of all congratulate George. I've been a fan of George's for quite some time. I get his emails and his socials. And I just am so happy about what he's doing, and I congratulate him. Well done, George. You're keeping up to. We're really happy. Many of us are happy about what you're doing. Much happy. Now, look, I'm also a prophetic poet, and I have written quite a few poets. In fact, my poetry book is being launched this weekend in Lismore, called The Road to Glory. And one of my poems I have written on, probably I've got many on this topic, but one of them is called Cracks. And it only takes a minute to read. Would you be happy for me to read it out?
Yes, let's hear this poem. Good on you, Wendy. Yes, let's hear it.
It's called Cracks. There are cracks in the world right now. Can you feel the earth is shifting? The foundations are starting to rumble, and it feels like a violent sifting. The wheat and tares are shaking as things are coming apart. Nothing seems real anymore, and this is affecting our heart. The battle is on between good and evil. It's ramping up every day. The fight is over fear versus faith, but the lines are blurry and grey. What is true and what is false? We need to search it out so we can walk along a path that's true without a doubt. When Jesus walked upon the earth, he warned us of these days. He taught us how to live through them, to follow in his ways. He said to build our lives on him and seek him out each day, that he would chart a path for us and help us through the fray. It's vital that we read his word. It gives us so much hope. And when the storms are on us, it helps us all to cope. He said we'd win the battle. He'd teach us how to fight, that we would overcome if we would hold on tight. The many trials and testings should strengthen us each day as we lean on our beloved and trust him and obey.
Wendy, well done with that. And Wendy Boniface, and the launch of your poetry book this weekend. Wendy, I hope there'll be some listeners who'll search for that. Just give us the name of your book.
The book is called The Road to Glory.
The Road to Glory. And Wendy Boniface in Casino in New South Wales. George, good sentiments in there. Any thoughts here for Wendy?
Fantastic. Well, thanks very much, Wendy, for sharing that with us. Great to see that two fine things come out of Casino now, beautiful poetry and beautiful beef. So thank you very much for sharing that. I'm sure there's much more good. What's that, sorry?
We don't eat bugs.
What was that, Wendy?
Here.
They don't eat bugs in Casino.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Okay.
Yeah. Well, look, I'll have to get my hands on that poetry book, because that's the one thing that what Wendy has just read out there does bring to mind. It's easy to get depressed, but we've got to put. There's one key line there. It was talking about faith over fear. And that's what we've got to have, Neil. Despite all the world, going to hell in a handbasket all around us, we've got to have faith over fear. That we know from reading the good book that this is where it all leads, that everything will fall away eventually. And there's going to be a new earth, a new hope, a new horizon for us. And, we put our faith in Jesus Christ, and that. And that
before we let Wendy
that we
go
get through all
here, there
this.
was faith over fear, but there was also words of wisdom in your poetry, Wendy, about the fight. There's a certain sense in which a lot of Christian believers, people who are holding to those foundations of our Christian faith and recognise the way that Christianity's formed our heritage, ready to roll over in the fight. You're a bit of a walking, talking example of how you don't roll over in the fight here, George. What are your thoughts on that concept that's coming through in Wendy's poem?
Yeah, well, look, I think that you're right on that. I mean, you can go to the two extremes, I guess, where you're very worried about what's going on right now, and you are completely fearful about what's going on, to the point where you're just let it roll over, as you say, and just let's bring on Judgment Day. Let's get there. But no, we pray. We should be praying a prayer every day, the Lord's Prayer, Neil, where it says, our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. That's not just words that we say. That's something to instruct us. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. It is our duty as Christians to try and make the will of God in our lives, in our families, in our societies, in our communities, and our nations be the will of this earth, not just, his will in heaven. We want it on earth as it is in heaven.
Okay, and Wendy, congratulations on your new book of poetry. Listeners might like to keep an eye out for that. Thanks so much for your contribution today on 2020. Let's take another call. Jenny is in Henty in New South Wales. Hi, Jenny. Welcome.
Good morning.
Jenny, what are your thoughts?
Yes. Just listening to what you're saying. Certainly we need to always remember that God is in control and He is sovereign. He's working things out.
Good thoughts. George, God is in control. What are your thoughts for Jenny?
100%. God is in control of our ultimate destinies and our ultimate, ultimately where all of this is going to go. Again, I would just reiterate what was just said then from your nudge, Neil, that that doesn't mean that, though, that we throw our hands up and just say, well, let it all be in God's control and we don't need to do anything. I repeat again that, our job as Christians is to make his will done here on earth as it is in heaven. And I think that that is why we've got to be worried, I guess, about the trajectory of our culture, the trajectory of our politics, the trajectory of our economics, the trajectory of our demographics. The question is his will being done on earth right now as it is in heaven? I think the answer would have to be a resounding no to that. So it does have to still concern us as Christians about how far society and civilization is moving away from his will.
Jenny, thank you so much for your call. Our talkback line open 1800 316 316 to join in our conversation. We'll take some more calls shortly. Let's see if we can cover a lot of ground quickly. If there wasn't so much to talk about, George, there's geopolitical developments, the threat of world war, even as we're sitting here today. The threat of world war, whether it's Russia in their invasion of Ukraine or whether it's the possibility of what happens if China invades Taiwan, or what's developing with Iran and their nuclear weapons program, the fears that the Jewish nation has. There are all sorts of geopolitical developments that put us all at threat. What are your thoughts for those things rising?
We need to ensure at all costs that there is not another world war, that we do whatever it takes, because that will be absolutely and utterly destructive, Neil, to all of mankind. And again, I would say that I do not think that that is his will, that we engage in another mass-scale global war like that. Of course, we've got to stand up to tyrants and bullies and tyranny and all the rest of it. But the calamity that any war now involving nuclear weapons would cause, and destruction that would cause, would be absolutely and utterly catastrophic, beyond the likes of which we've never ever experienced before as humanity, not just a civilization. The whole human world will never have experienced anything like that before. I got to say that, just going back to my point about the fall of politics, I think that unfortunately, and this is not to point the finger at Western culture, but Western governments, particularly the United States, has become captured, and it's been that way for a long time now, by the what we call the military-industrial complex, who sees its job as just forever engaging in forever wars that then end up costing lives and then end up costing a lot of money for very little effort, actually. And we saw that in Afghanistan, mate. I mean, how much money that was spent there, how many lives were lost there in Afghanistan, and for what? We had the Taliban to start with. We drove them out, and now the Taliban are back again, and they got a heap of weapons and gear out of the United States government and its allies. So, I think we need to be mindful of that and stepping back from the brink. At the moment, again, without getting into the complexities of Ukraine, Russia, China, Taiwan, collectively the world just needs to take a breath and step back from the brink. That's what I'd just say, Neil.
Okay, let's take another call. 1800 316 316 to join our conversation. Let's hear from Wayne in Mackay. Hi, Wayne. Welcome.
Yeah, mate. Yeah, George, you've been a huge asset to the people with what's not understanding with what's been going on in Mackay. I'm from Mackay myself, and I'm like yourself, mate. I'm a Christian, and I'm not ignorant to everything that's happening, or nothing at all. But at the end of the day, mate, with Gates and all that, with what they're trying to do, and they reckon the next pandemic's going to be worse than the last one. It's all manipulation as far as I'm concerned, and we've just got to trust in God with all that's happening there, mate, and do our best. I certainly haven't gone ahead and got the vaccines. I got respect for people that have. They put a lot of people in a position where they've had no choice. But at the end of the day, mate, it's you just got to get on with life and just trust God with everything that's happened.
Wayne,
Like,
good thoughts there. Manipulation, coercion, whether it's the pandemic response with vaccinations or whether it might be on a whole lot of other different levels where there is coercive government control. Your thoughts here, George, for Wayne?
Yeah. My thoughts from what Wayne said. Well, thank you. It's always great to get someone from my hometown that's giving me a pat on the back. That's good. But look, to get to the issue, there's just been such a disconnect, I think, and a growing disconnect between our governments and what our citizenry want. And there's also a growing disconnect between the way we are governed and the way we should be governed, and the protection of our freedoms and our liberties. And we saw that during the pandemic. Now, that's not just the fault of governments, even though they shouldn't be doing what they're doing with mandates and all the rest of it, I firmly believe. It is also the fault of culture. Very, very quickly, Neil, to talk about two different aspects. Oswald Spengler wrote this sort of magnus opus called the Fall of the West, the Fall of Western Civilization, I think it was. And what he said in that in that book, he said a lot because it's a 3-volume set, I think. There was what he talked about, the age of the last man, or the age of Caesars, and he said that we're going to, as things collapse around us, we're going to want to preserve security and safety. And so we're going to want our governments to become more authoritarian and militaristic to protect us from all of these perceived outside threats. And, that will be taken advantage of. We had Nietzsche, who certainly isn't a Christian, Friedrich Nietzsche, but Friedrich Nietzsche talked about the last man as well. And what he said about the last man, it was one that the last man was going to be enslaved to his passion, but he was also going to be someone that wanted all of the comfort, all of the security that could be mustered to his defence. And so I think that we're living through that age, and it's interesting how those people lived, 100 years ago or more, and wrote their theories down, and it seems to be coming to pass right now. But I shouldn't be so surprised about that. There was other people that wrote stuff 2,000 years ago that is coming to pass in a book called the Bible. So anyway, that's what comes to mind when Wayne says what he says.
Wayne, thank you so much for your call. 1-800-316-316 to join in our conversation. Coercion is one of those words. You can apply that to a whole lot of different spheres. But when you say about the last man standing, the comfort, the security, the protection, one of the things that's being propagated now is this thought of the ESG, the environment, social and governance aspects of how organisations will operate, and that lending itself to the possibility of the social credit system. That's the fear, isn't it, that people have if there is going to be all sorts of government regulation over keeping us safe, that somehow or other we'll soon be coerced into a certain level of behaviour that will be very coercive and along the lines of what maybe perhaps a sinister government might want us to be doing. So thoughts here, George, taking you into another sort of deeper area.
Well, I wonder if we're having a mind meld moment here, or if you've been looking at my YouTube account, because my last video, which just released today, is on ESG and how it's a major scam or a sham, and the one I released yesterday, I think, was on the social credit system in part. So look, you're right. The ESG stands for environmental, social and governance. It's all the rave within the corporate sector right now and in governments. And what we're seeing is corporations, big multinational corporations, becoming more involved with the governing of our lives. And they do this through justifying it all through the fact that, we've got to be more concerned about the environment. So they're even now concerned about you as a customer and what you're doing as their clients, and as if they have some right to actually govern you as just being a customer. And so that's why it won't be hard to see in the future banks, they're already doing it now. There's one Australian bank that's actually precluded any loans going out to people that are going to buying conventional cars. So you can only purchase an electric vehicle with loans from this bank. So there's already a credit card in existence that you can voluntarily sign up to that limits your daily spending habits to ensure that your climate footprint isn't so large that it affects the planet, apparently. I think that given that technology's there, this perhaps may be the way of the future. Will there be a social credit system that comes into play? I'm not sure. There's people out there that are pushing for that overtly. There's actually one voluntarily in existence in a province in Italy. But I think what's more likely to happen is that this sort of social credit system will just creep in with everything else that's coming in. We will find it's here before we even know that it was instituted. And, I could talk for another hour on that, Neil, and we don't have time, but go and have a look at my YouTube videos, so to say.
Well, you've got environment in itself. Here we are, as Christian believers, saying that stewardship of the environment's a good thing. So there are some twists in all of this, but the climate change alarmism and the things that can come from that might concern listeners. Social and governance, all of those things sound right in themselves, but when you start to apply a way that the regulation looks right to one ideology and wrong to another, then you've got the potential for overtaking a system, and we might be able to look at China and say that they've got a social credit system whereby they're controlling the masses. So somehow or other, George, I've thought that you should add another letter to the ESG, an F for freedom. So if you actually added something to the end of that and said, okay, let's make that a condition of who you are, then you can actually bring those things into a little bit more context, can't you?
Yeah, well, that'd throw the whole movement into chaos because, let's be quite honest here, ESG is the Trojan horse that the cultural Marxists that our friend Bill Muhlenberg talks about have used to actually slip into yet another institution that no one ever thought that the Marxists would actually get their hands on, and that institution is the corporations. I mean, the very thing that they despise. And so there's been this recognition that they are now a permanent reality within our economies, within our societies, and they are a useful tool to do things that governments might not be able to do simply because governments are beholden to the we hope there is still some vestige of governments being able to be beholden to the will of the people. If they go too far, we throw them out. But we can't throw out a company. We can't throw out a bank. We can't throw out an energy provider. In some of these things, they become essential, so much so that we're captive to them rather than them being captive to us. So this is a worrying trend indeed, Neil.
Well, we've run out of time, and we could have covered all sorts of issues today, including race relations and the proposal for an Indigenous voice to the Parliament. We could have talked some more globally about the Great Reset. We could have talked some more about environmental activism, net zero. Could have even talked some more about some of the concerns that so many hold around central banks and digital currencies. There might be some good conversations for another day too, George, and I know that you cover a lot of these sorts of things. Again. We do, and just to hear some thoughts on these things, and hearing those coming from a foundation where you've got Christian faith in the mix, whereby we face a future not with fear, but with faith, and knowing that, as one of our listeners called in and said, God is ultimately in control. So where does that put us? Not fearful, but faith-driven in the way we might have a fight for some things that would keep us free and some challenging areas there that threaten to overtake us, that we not be deceived, even as we're warned in Matthew chapter 24. Let me point people to how you can connect with George Christensen. I mentioned in his life after Parliament, he's emerged as a commentator on the challenges that face the West, and he's writing about these sorts of things we're talking about today, not holding back on his commentary blog called Nation First. You can connect there, nationfirst.substack.com. And there's also a George Christensen website, georgechristensen.com.au. George, thanks so much for taking some time to share your thoughts and your heart with us today on 2020.
Thank you so much, Neil, and thanks to your listeners.